Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.
Today, I would like to thank the Madinah Institute at the PMI Arabian Gulf chapter for the invitation. We're going to talk about today about change management, how to manage change in a project and not to fail trying. Change management is a topic that is very dear to my heart because as a practitioner of project management, I have been involved in many projects that have succeeded or failed because of poor or good change management practices. A little bit about myself. I am an engineer, as Ali was mentioning, and I've been in the business for 22 years. Currently, I'm working in the marine research industry as a program manager. And as told, I have been involved with the PMI chapter for many, many years locally here in Victoria, British Columbia. Originally, I was born in Colombia, and I've been living in Canada since 2004. So let's start by stating the objectives of today's session. The first objective is to understand what change management is in the context of a project. There are different disciplines in the business world that deal with change management, but we're going to talk about what it means within the context of a project. That is our main topic of interest today, although many areas around change management are actually applicable to many other areas in the business administration side. The second objective is to describe the cycle of change in a project, and you will see that there are, from the PMI perspective, very clear guidelines as to how to look at the change within the context of a project, and we're going to talk about that. And finally, we're going to look at 4 different tools that I have specifically used in the past to manage some of the basic elements of change management. Talking about tools is a little bit complex because there are many, many tools out there. So I'm just going to give you a glance of what is out there and what can be used to actually manage change within a project. So let's start by saying that there are many definitions around change management. I just put this here because it has 3 elements of what I want to convey as a main message today. The first one is that change management is a comprehensive, cyclic, and structured approach. So what I try to say here is that we need to make sure that we have a way to manage change. There is no way that change is going to happen by itself in a project. It has to be properly managed. And it has to be managed in a way that is clear, is systemic, and as it says here, is structured. The second element here is that we're talking about transitioning individuals, groups, and organizations. Many people believe that change is only there affecting a person or a particular area. But as we will see later, there are really different components of change that may affect those 3 entities, individuals, groups, and organizations. And the last component of this definition is taking them from a current state to a future state with an intended business benefit. So there is no change if there is no gap to be filled. And that's something that people need to understand, and we will see in a second why. So these 3 elements comprise what I personally believe is the most accurate definition of change management within the context of a project. Why do we change? There are many reasons why change happens. There are few of them in this slide. One of them is because the business environment changed, and I don't think that anyone here believes that's not an accurate statement. Business environment changes all the time, and that brings up change in the organization and individuals. Another reason is because our organization changes. We may be, for example, involved in a merge and acquisition process. We may be involved in an expansion process, and all those things bring change to the organization. Our people change. Every time somebody changes in the organization, maybe the administration style changes. Maybe someone wants to bring up a new process. Our own people in the field feel that a grassroots initiative is important, and they ask for change. And the last one, and no less important, is the fact that many times legislation and political aspects change, and therefore we have to change. And again, I bring up here the comment of this has to be planned. We cannot wait this to happen randomly, so we have to really, really plan for those changes. Now, how is that related to projects? So there are two ways in which projects and changes are related. The first one is when there is a strategic initiative or projects, it actually drives change. Or in a different way, if we start a project, it is very, very likely that the project is going to bring a change. In order to better understand this relationship, I am bringing here a diagram from the PMI guide managing change in organizations. And what we can see in this slide is that there is a continuum between the strategy, the portfolio, programs and projects, and operations. Typically, business decisions from the strategic perspective drive value decisions in our project portfolio perspective. Then we execute those as programs and projects, and once that they're handed over to operations, they start to realize their business value. And as you can see here, change management is something that actually crosses over the four of those steps. There are, of course, feedback loops that will take us to rethink our strategy or rethink our portfolio or try to execute new projects so that they bring more value to the organization. So I think this particular diagram here shows in a very, very clear way how PMI looks at change as part of the whole portfolio, program, and project cycle. Now, a slightly different view, but more or less with the same message, is this one here. It's a little bit more busy, but it actually shows that changes are not a one-time thing, but they're actually cyclical. So there's always a first cycle where we do many things, and we will talk about those in the next section of the presentation. And once that we finish, we're not done. Typically, we do measure our benefits, and we go back and restate how those benefits are being realized, and therefore, do we need to continue doing the same thing, or, as usually happens, do you need to go back and replan your business value, therefore bringing up new projects, which, by the way, will bring up new change. So again, this is a different perspective, but it's more or less the same message, which is the fact that this is a cyclical process and that all those components are actually interrelated. So just a few words about models of change. And this is something that, again, goes back to the basic understanding of what changes are. And many people believe that changes are a psychological transition. Many people think that change is really a process is something that we need to work as a input process output model. Some other people think that change is a system model, which means that there are very many interrelated components, and all of them really bring up a final result, which is what we want. And then there are people who believe that change is actually just a mirror of our business practices. So every time that we want to make changes, make business in a different way, we actually are changing. In any of these four theories that you can explore in any of the change management texts, and even the PMI Managed Change Guide describes some of those in detail. In all of them, there is a common element, which is the fact that things are not meant to stay the same when a project happens. So either we consider that a psychological transition, a process, a system model, or just a mirror of what our businesses are doing, we have to be aware that things are changing. So this is the introduction of what change management is in the context of a project. So what we are going to do now is we're going to start talking about the change lifecycle framework. So this is a framework which has been proposed by PMI and is outlined in the Managing Change in Organizations Practice Guide. And what we're going to do for the next 20 minutes or so is going to go through each one of these components and understand what it means. So I know this looks like a busy slide, but we're going to actually decompose that and look at each one of these different elements and see how it actually works. So the first thing that we can see here on the top of the graph is that we are portraying the fact that we are right now in a current state, and through changes in our business strategy, we're going to move to a future state. And it's in that future state when we are going to realize the business value of our changes. Now, we want to look at what happens in that cycle. The first thing that happens is that based on our current state, we need to formulate a change. So the formulation of a change has three different components. We have to identify or clarify the need for change, assess how ready we are for a change, and scope out the change. So what does it mean in practical terms for us project management practitioners? When we try to identify or clarify the need for a change, one of the things that we need to look at is the change readiness versus the urgency to change. Are we doing this because, for example, our business is being threatened, so really we don't have any other choice but to change? Or is this something that we may want to leave for later on when we probably attack more pressing business issues? So that's one question that we need to ask ourselves when we're trying to identify the need for a change. The second thing is that we need to communicate our strategic intent. So remember that all of these changes actually come from a strategic objective, a business objective. Therefore, we need to clearly state what is that we are trying to do from the strategic perspective. So this is one of those things that probably you have heard as there is no change for change. It's just that change comes from a strategic intent. So we need to clearly state why we're trying to make this change happen in our organization. The next thing that we need to make sure is that we actually outline what the difference between the changes in the organization itself and the strategic changes that we're trying to achieve. So many times changes are related to organizational changes, like for example, we are opening up a new function or we are going to expand geographically. That's an organizational change, but the strategic change is trying to improve our revenue, trying to cut our costs, trying to improve our customer satisfaction. So we need to make sure that we really make people understand that the change is actually coming from the strategic perspective. Now, on the topic of assessment readiness, this is probably one of the most complex areas, especially when we're trying to formulate a change, because typically we are in an early stage and we don't necessarily understand everything that is going to happen. So what it means is that we need to understand clearly the change and its interactions. How is the change going to affect the relationship between our different business components? How is it going to affect the relationship with our clients? How is it going to change the relationship with our suppliers? And those interactions have to be qualified as either positive or negative. The reality is that in many cases we have both. We always think that change should be positive, but the reality is that in many cases change drives also negative aspects, and therefore we have to be aware of those when we are assessing the readiness for the change. And the last step, or the formulate change stage of our cycle, is to make a clear impact assessment. So what is that is going to change? And we need to be exhaustive, because one of the worst cases that you can find in a change management process is when you hit the later stages of the change cycle and there are things that pop up that you don't really understand. So really, in the first step of this whole process, you need to actually clearly understand what is the what is the impact that you will have in your different business components. Once that you have that, you can actually go back and say, this is exactly what I want to change, therefore I can scope out the change. So these are the 3 steps related to the first phase of the life cycle framework, which is formulate the change. The second stage is to actually plan the change. So once that we have formulated the change, now that we understand what is going to happen, what is going to change, how ready we are, we need to start planning. Planning the change means 3 things. First, define the change approach. So we need to understand how we're going to drive the change. Second, we need to engage our stakeholders. And this is a very interesting area, because this has many components that are tied together to our common and well-known project management practices. So we need to engage with the stakeholders in order to make sure that we're actually driving the plan the right way. And finally, you can argue, this is the most important part, of course, is you need to plan the transition and the integration of the different changes to your current organization. As you can see here, the plan change is something that happens pretty much during the whole cycle of the change. So of course you will have a first approach when you start the change, but then you will have to go back and revisit the activities as you move along in the change. So what exactly all these 3 things mean? Define the change approach. What it basically means is that you have to define how many steps are you going to take, the sequence, the type of leadership that you're going to apply to your change. Is this going to be imposed, or is this going to be a more collaborative approach? How involved your stakeholders are going to be? What is the focus of the change? Is the people, is the process, is the organization? And then you start thinking about the different components of the planning. Here comes a very interesting topic. Include in your project plan. So this is probably the first time that these two things, the change management and the project management, kind of come together. And this is something that I have learned through my practice, and again, I have seen many projects succeed and fail because they do or they don't do this, is that you have to include your change management activities within your project plan. This is part of your project. You have to include those activities so that they are properly accounted for as part of the work that you're going to perform within the project. And of course, as a good PM, you will actually go back and identify risks specific to the change. I have seen, for example, some methodologies where you have two risk registers, one for your project and one for your change management. And that's probably a good practice when you have very complex changes or when you have changes that actually are more demanding on your workload and your different work streams than your typical smaller change. So you would like to identify risks that are directly linked and probably will be owned by the change management work package. Then you plan stakeholder engagement, which is something that probably you know from project management practices. So the two areas where you would like to really put a little bit more emphasis are communication plans, because you really want to make sure that the stakeholders are always in line with the execution of the different phases of the change and your project. And the other one, which is a big one, is issue management. So there are no easy changes. Every change will have some very specific challenges, and those challenges will come back to you in the form of issues. So you have to have an issue management process very specific to change management. And this is something different to what we're used to do as project managers, because we typically deal with issues in the project, and they are typically managed as project changes. But when you're talking about change management, you have to be aware that maybe you cannot resolve the issues the same way, and that those issues will have to probably go through a longer cycle to be resolved, even in some cases being brought as an end result of the change, and then you have to hand it over to someone to really work or understand how those issues are going to affect the business in the long run. So issue management is a very key aspect of stakeholder engagement. And the last item in the plan change is the transition and integration planning, which is you need to understand how big is the change, how many people will be affected, how many business areas will be affected, how many processes will be affected. Then you need to plan to either bring or build the different capabilities that you need in order to manage the change. And finally, you have to plan for the managerial transition. So how is the change going to be transitioned to the different management areas within your organization? All these planning activities, again, have to be included in the project plan. So this is the second component of our lifecycle framework. So we have formulated the change, and now we have planned the change. So let's move into the third stage of the framework, which is implementing the change. So the implementation of the change has three different steps. The first one is to prepare the organization for the change. The second is to mobilize the stakeholders. And then you have to deliver the project outputs. And here we're talking about the project outputs that are related to the change management portion. So we're not talking about here about the normal project deliverables, but the ones that are related to the change management. So let's talk about each one of these in detail. So the first aspect is to prepare the organization for the change. So I'm going to talk about this for a few minutes because this is probably one of the key areas where I have seen projects fail on the change management side. Because the first thing that you need to find out is what resources do you need? And of course, if you have or you don't have the resources within your project team. As these change management practices mature within the project management environment, as project managers, we understand that there are very, very specific skills and abilities that are needed in order to bring up change in a project. And the truth is that in many cases, we don't have the resources, and we don't have that expertise. So typically what happens, especially in more complex changes, is that you create a change management team. Now, the change management team can be as small or as large as is required, but really what you're trying to do is you're trying to have people, resources focus 100% in change. And it is a good practice to actually isolate them a little bit from the project work. So you may want to have those resources work in a very close team, talking to the different teams in the project, not related to change. Only when they're really required to do that. Of course, that communication has to be very consistent, but you want to bring up those resources and those expertise just to work for the change. The next thing that you have to do also is to make assessments. So we talk about planning the assessments. Here is the stage where you actually perform the assessments. Typically, those assessments happen in cycles. So you have to have a first assessment just to know where you are, to create your baseline for the change. But also, you have to keep on assessing the change as the change moves along. The reason is because you will have to feedback the process and understand if what you plan is what is being really executed, and also if what you're planning is really bringing the value that you expect to the project. So you have to make sure that you perform the assessments at the beginning of the process and then as you move along. So that's how you prepare the organization for change. Bringing resources, bringing the expertise or having those in the project, and running your assessments to make sure that you have a pretty good baseline for the change. Then the next step is to mobilize the stakeholders. So you need to bring up the stakeholders to your project in such a way that they perform as you expect. So things that you have to do is you have to monitor people. You have to monitor how they're performing. You have to monitor how good the change is being accepted, how good is being implemented. If things are not going right, then you need to make sure that you change your approach. Okay, if this is not working, what else I have to do? A great example is training. Training is one of these components of change management that is often overlooked or believed just to be a part of the project, but it's really an activity of project management, or sorry, of change management. So you decide that you want to train people by giving them a training in a classroom setting. You run your classroom sessions, and then you find out that people are not really up to speed with what is supposed to be the subject of the training. What do? Do you run a new session or do you change your approach? That's what happens in this phase. You have to go back, monitor, and say, well, if this is not working, this is what I need to change. And the last element of this stakeholder mobilization is conflict management. And it is almost like a given that any and every project with a change, especially if it is a complex change, is going to bring conflict. So we need to make sure that we manage conflict the right way. And this is, for example, where resources with expertise on things like conflict management really bring up the best of the team in such a way that we can actually manage properly those elements of conflict within the different components of the change. So once that we have prepared, mobilized, we execute, and then we deliver our project outputs. And again, these are in the context of the change management. So typically what happens is that when we deliver the outputs of the change management, we need to assess how the change has been, or that specific part of the change has been completed. So we have to go back and say, yep, this actually worked, therefore we're moving ahead with our plan, or no, this is not really what we expected, so let's change our approach and let's do something different. So the project output includes also an assessment on how good this change has been accepted, or how well it has been accepted within the organization. If the output is not acceptable, then you have to go back and basically review and modify what you're trying to achieve. So this is no different to any other project delivery phase. Again, the specifics are related to our change. Then we move to the last stage of what we refer to as the delivery of the change, which is managing the transition. So typically in projects, we have to transfer our project results to someone. So we need to transition those outputs into the business. We have to start measuring adoption rates and benefits. And if, again, something has not worked, we adjust. So I'm going to stop here a little bit because, as you can see, there's also few arrows here that we need to understand. So once that we formulate, plan, and implement, and once that we start managing the transition into the business, as you can see, there are arrows that go back to each one of those phases that are branded adaptive change. What it means is that many times as we execute a project, especially if it's a complex project and even a long-running project, things change within the environment, things change within the project, things change in our environment, and therefore we also need to start adapting our change to those changes. So it's like a second level of feedback. And as we're managing the transition, we also have to monitor for those changes in the environment so that we are sure that our change is being effective as initially stated by the business objectives. So how do we manage transition? The first thing that we have to do is to evaluate our operational capacity, that to operate or to really manage the changes that we are executing, we have the right number of people, we have the systems, we have the support that we need. So once that we're sure that we have that, we have to make sure that we start measuring how things are being adopted by the organization. So here we come again. We have to assess. We have to assess based on the results. So for example, if I'm deploying a new process, and the new process is now live and people are using it, we need to understand how is it being used. Is it effective? We were expecting to reduce the time in which we execute this process in 50%. Is that accurate? Is that 50%? Is that 25%? Is that 0%? Is this process, which happens many times, actually bringing more work to people? So we need to assess clearly how that is performing, which is the first time that we actually have enough information to measure the benefit realization. So we were expecting this to improve our revenue, to decrease our costs, to improve our customer satisfaction. So this is the first time, once that the change is actually within the business, that we can start measuring those benefits. And this is also a tricky proposition for many project managers, because project managers typically believe that once that they deliver, that's it. The answer is no, there are a little bit more things. And finally, we adjust again in order to make sure that we address any discrepancies within the project. So within all these life cycle steps, we also have something which is sustain the change. So once that the change has happened, we need to make sure that it is lasting and is there to benefit our organization. So how do we achieve that? We achieve that by making sure that we communicate with our stakeholders. We have to make sure that we create what we call sense-making activities, things that are reiterating our vision, address any type of ambiguity in the change, and also motivate people to understand the change. And this is where we measure the benefits. So as long as we are doing all these things, we are reassuring our organization that we can sustain the change in the long run. Now, the last thing about the framework is who is responsible for what. So on the portfolio side, because this is a strategic activity, these are the areas that typically formulate the change. When you're moving into planning the change, managing the transition, and sustaining the change, supporting that, you're moving into a more operational area, and this is typically what program managers do. And finally, the actual implementation of the change falls into the project team. Now, who sustain the changes? Basically, the operations or the business areas are the ones that are called to sustain the change over time. So the last 5 minutes, I'm going to spend talking about some of the tools that I have used in the past to manage and to help change. So the first basic tool is what I call the change complexity matrix. And this is a matrix that outlines 2 dimensions, which is how big is the organizational change and how strategic is the change. So we have 4 different quadrants here. And the first thing that you try to do when you understand the change and assess how difficult is it going to be for organization is to actually use something like this. So is this change something that, for example, is highly revolutionary and is going to extensively change the organization? So we're basically talking about the top right quadrant, which is basically we're betting our company to this change. If it goes right, we will be successful. If it goes wrong, probably organization is history. Or is this a small change, minimal change with minimal evolutionary change? So basically this is not going to affect us too much, so we can probably continue business as usual even if the change doesn't happen as we expect. So this talks about change complexity, and it's a fairly simple way of looking at how complex is going to be our task of managing the change. The second tool is what I call the Stakeholder Map. This is actually similar to some tools that are out there for stakeholder management in the project management world. And basically what it talks about is how much interest is that the stakeholder has on the change and how much power that stakeholder has. So if it's, for example, a high power stakeholder and the interest in the change is high, you really need to manage that stakeholder closely. Conversely, if you have a low power stakeholder, someone that is not going to affect your change very much, and the interest is low, then probably you only need to monitor them and make sure that they understand what's going on, but you don't spend too much time or too much effort managing them. So this is a tool that you can use in your plan change to understand how you're going to plan your communications and your engagement with your stakeholder. The third tool that I'm bringing here is what is called the communication scale. So how much do you want to communicate with the different people involved in the change? So as you can see, we have two dimensions here. One is time and one is degree of support. So depending on the degree of support, as the higher it is, the more complex the communications will be. So you go to the top, number 7 here, you have to make sure that these stakeholders that are being communicated really internalize their changes. So what it means is that you have to perform communications activities on the visioning side. You have to really make them understand the strategy. You have to have private meetings with those people that don't really get the change or they're resisting the change. And you have to make sure that you make them participant on their success. Whereas if you just want to people understand what's going on, you go to the lower end of the scale and you just send a few communications, emails, etc. So this is a good point because you don't manage change by email. So as you can see here, it is a very, very simple tool that is going to be useful just at the beginning of the change and just with those people that are probably not too much interested or involved in the change. So this is a great tool that I have used in the past to plan the communications for the different types of stakeholders. And the last tool that I want to share with you today is this tool, and you will have access to this material, and there is the link down there. And it is a change management impact assessment tool, which is very, very simple. And I'm not going to go into the details here because we don't have enough time, so you're free to download the tool and actually play with it. But you will see that there are many areas here that are being assessed. And the thing is that it gives actually a qualified and quantified view of the impact of the change. So basically you can put more emphasis in activities that are going to be impacting the organization more and put less emphasis on those activities that don't necessarily affect your change too much. So I'm going to conclude with a brief summary. So change management and project management are closely aligned, and we already saw that there is a way to actually bring the different components of project management within the change management perspective. Since most projects generate change, more changes are driven projects, you cannot make one live without the other. So you have to make sure that you have a very good plan for both. We understand the complexity of changes, and here is an example. We're talking about this because we are interested in how changes are going to be managed within the context of a project. You're called to understand and plan for the changes in any role you have, project, program, or portfolio manager, or even if you're a project sponsor or executive. You need to understand and make sure that you make the change successful. And the one thing that I learned in my practice for many years working with very complex projects is that if you don't have fun, this is going to be a really, really tough process for you. So have fun and make sure that you are able to perform the change as the organization expects. And I think that within the time frame that I was allocated for this very complex topic, so 45 minutes is really a challenge, but I think I gave you enough information to at least generate some questions on your end. So Ali, I think that this is the time where I send this back to you for Q&A.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, sir. And now, folks, we are open for the question and answers. If you have any questions, you could either raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your console, right side of your screen. So you can click on it, and I should give you the chance to speak to the speaker. Or you could put it in the question box, and I'll be happy to read them over on your behalf. So let me go straight to the caller who has raised his hand. See, we have audio from Brother Muhammad Saeed. Brother Muhammad, you raised your hand, sir. Do you have any question? Could you please introduce and ask a question?
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. I know that change management is not, it's very complicated subject. I know that for sure there are big entities. They have, a change management department to manage all the changes being implemented throughout the years, okay, in their entities and organizations. What is the relationship between change management department, BMO, okay, and here we are not talking about the changes as a result of project. We are talking about change on the strategic level, and part of it is a project management, is how to deliver this change, right?
Yes, so let me address those two questions in a single answer because those are related. So the answer to the second question is yes, we're talking about the execution of the change within the context of a project. And therefore, what many organizations, especially those with a more mature project management project management practice, and those with more mature business practices have, as you say, is two different entities, that one that manages changes within the project context and one that manages changes by itself. So you may have, in some cases, a change management department. And I have an excellent example in my last engagement. There was a change management group which was reporting to the same functional manager for that particular area because it was a program. And there was a close relationship between the PMO and the change management group, but they were not linked to each other. So they were linked up in the functional side. However, I have known a couple of organizations here in where I work that do have a change management group within the PMO. So those organizations have seen, for example, that via failed projects or things like that, the change was key in the success or failure of that particular project, and they decided, okay, let's put a group together and let's make that group part of the PMO so that they actually embedded within the project structure of the organization and they can start actually driving change early on in the process. So I don't think that there is a simple answer to that question, but it really, I mean, the element that is key here is how mature is the organization, because in many cases you have projects running without even a single person being assigned a formal role within a change management function, and that really shows is that the organization is not mature and doesn't really understand or doesn't have the need, because this is something that happens one-off, which is more rarely happening right now. So yeah, again, not a simple answer, but those are 2 or 3 different models that I have seen in my professional practice.
Okay, Brother Saif, do you have any further questions, or should we move to another caller?
I have one more question, if you allow me, please.
Sure,
Here,
ahead, please.
when we talk about change management, we are talking about different aspects of change, not only technical deliverables. We are talking about also cultural deliverables, or the impact of this change on culture, on the organization, on people, and all of those, okay, on the different stakeholders. So yes, here, okay, I understand that if your working environment is very dynamic, so a lot of changes need to be implemented, adopted and implemented. You need first to build a business case where you link up those changes to the strategy, your strategy. And this is the first one, what you call it, identifying or understanding, analyzing the change. Then you plan it, then you implement it, then you sustain it, okay? So yes. Here, my questions here, okay, we are not only focusing on technical deliverables of the project or this change, we need to consider the other aspect, which is like cultural aspect and all this stuff, right?
Yes, and that's why this is so new and different for many project managers, because we tend to be on the technical side and understanding technical, not only pure technical, but technical things that we can touch and we can manage. But really we're talking about the soft side of changes, which is processes, which is people, which is culture. And again, many times you will be surprised how many projects fail because we don't necessarily understand those other components. and you're implementing a new application, and you may have all the technical elements there and everything, but what happens if at the end people don't use the application? I mean, there's nothing you can do, right? What happens if, for example, the call Hello, Ali?
Yes, sir. Sorry, I had a brief disconnect. I believe
Yeah, I saw you.
yeah, I believe I lost Brother Muhammad Saif also. So let me go to another caller we have. Sorry about that. We have Brother Zain Al-Rahmani. Brother, can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm hearing you. Are you hearing me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you. Could you please introduce yourself and ask the question, sir?
Good afternoon. I'm Zain Romani from Integrated Telecom. Thank you for the nice presentation. My question is, are there some criteria to measure the change in such a way to take a decision either to go in the implementation of the project or to stop the project because the changes, the impact on of the change is so disaster in the project, either to stop it or to continue the project? Is there some criteria or some scaling or percentage of the changes?
Excellent question. Thank you very much. I'm going to probably give you an answer you don't like, but the answer is no. There's nothing out there that you can actually measure blindly as well. This is the percentage or whatever that you can use, but you're on the right track, because one of the first things that you have to do when you start formulating the change and planning the change is to decide how you're going to measure how the change is being effective within the project. And in some cases, if not in all, you have to say, well, if we don't get to this point, for example, if you don't get a number of users willing to use the new application, or the number of users being able to get into this new business process, then you have to establish gates within your project and say, okay, you formulate and plan the change, you have to establish those metrics, and you have to establish a gate in which you will decide, is this going to move forward? Do I have to revisit things, or do I have to kill the project? So it's really, really a good practice to have that from the get-go, because if you reach that point where you measure and you're not reaching something that you were expecting and you don't really know what it is, you don't know what to do. You don't know if you want to keep sinking money into the project or you want to stop it for a while or replan something. So it's really, really a very important aspect is to really make sure that you understand where you are and what are the next steps within the project.
Well, thank you very much, Brother Zain, for your question. Now, folks, that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. I would like to thank you, sir, for your time, especially on behalf of Madinah Institute of Leadership. I would like to extend our gratitude and thanks to you, sir. And thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give, sir, before we dismiss out?
Thank you very much, Ali.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Folks, a lot of you are asking about how to claim the PDU, as we had mentioned in the beginning, that all of you who have attended this webinar and remain attentive for a minimum 30 minutes of the duration, total duration, you shall receive an email within the next 24 hours with complete instructions on how to claim the PDU for this particular webinar from the PMI AGC chapter. With that note, I would like to conclude this webinar, and so you all will be automatically dismissed out. Thank you very much. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, from wherever you're calling from. Wassalamu
Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.